The scent of summer rain on hot asphalt hung heavy in the Cedar Creek air on the morning of June 15, 2011. For Sarah Miller, it was the smell of the last ordinary day of her life. Her husband, Daniel, a man whose hands were perpetually stained with grease but whose touch was always gentle, had left their small home with a familiar, cheerful promise. "Just a quick job on the Croft Mustang, Sarah Bear," he'd said, kissing her forehead. "I'll be back in time for Lily's softball game." He was a creature of habit, a man whose life ran with the comforting predictability of a well-tuned engine, making what came next an impossible, shattering anomaly. Danny Miller was more than a mechanic. He was an artist whose medium was steel and oil. His small, immaculately organized workshop, Miller's Masterworks, was a local institution in the quiet Oregon town. He possessed an almost supernatural talent for diagnosing an engine's ailments, hearing the subtle misfires and groans that others missed. It was this reputation that brought the town's wealthier residents to his door, including the reclusive millionaire, Richard Croft, and his prized cherry-red 1967 Shelby Mustang GT500. The car was Croft's obsession, and Danny was the only one he trusted to touch it. The afternoon sun began to dip below the towering pines that ringed the town, casting long, menacing shadows. Lily, dressed in her bright yellow softball uniform, kept peering out the front window, her mitt lying expectantly on the floor. "Mom, where's Daddy? We're going to be late," she'd whined, her 80-year-old voice laced with impatience. Sarah's calls to Danny's cell phone went straight to voicemail, each unanswered ring tightening the knot of anxiety in her stomach. It wasn't like him. He had never, not once, missed a game. As twilight bled into a starless night, a cold dread began to seep into the Miller household, more chilling than the evening air. Sarah drove the short distance to the workshop, her headlights cutting through the oppressive darkness of the industrial park. The main bay door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out onto the wet pavement, like a silent invitation. The familiar sounds of a clattering wrench or the hiss of an air tool were conspicuously absent. All she could hear was the frantic thumping of her own heart against her ribs. Inside, the scene was one of eerie stillness, a perfectly preserved moment in time. Danny's heavy-duty toolbox was open, its drawers meticulously arranged. A single wrench lay on the concrete floor next to the spot where the Mustang should have been. A half-empty mug of coffee sat on his workbench, now cold to the touch. The air was thick with the familiar, acrid smells of gasoline and motor oil, but a new metallic temp lingered beneath it all, a scent she couldn't place. The car was gone, and so was her husband. Panic gave way to a frantic search. Sarah's voice echoed in the cavernous space. "Danny, Danny, are you here?" She checked the small office, the cramped bathroom, the storage loft. His wallet, with his driver's license and a worn photo of her and Lily, was sitting on his desk. His keys were hanging on their designated hook by the door. He hadn't just left. He had vanished from the middle of his life, leaving behind only the ghost of his presence. The first call to the Cedar Creek Police Department was hesitant, filled with the self-conscious fear of overreacting. But as she explained the scene to the dispatcher, the reality of the situation began to solidify. The officer on the other end, accustomed to lost dogs and minor disputes, initially sounded placid. Yet, as Sarah described the abandoned wallet and keys, the professional calm in his voice sharpened into a more serious, focused tone. He promised to send a patrol car immediately. Standing alone in the silent garage, Sarah felt a profound sense of violation. This space, which had always been a symbol of her husband's passion and hard work, now felt menacing and alien. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret. Every drip of oil from a waiting engine sounded like a ticking clock. The world she had known, a world of softball games and promised homecomings, had fundamentally fractured, and she was standing at the epicenter of the break. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile attempt to ward off the encroaching chill. That had nothing to do with the temperature. Her gaze fell upon a grease-smudged calendar hanging on the wall. June 15th was circled in red, with the words, "Lily's Game," written in Danny's familiar, blocky handwriting. It was a stark, painful reminder of the simple joy that had been stolen from them, a promise that now hung in the air, broken and irreparable. The wail of a distant siren finally cut through the silence of the night, a sound that in any other circumstance would be alarming, but now brought a sliver of desperate hope. Help was coming. Answers were coming. But as the flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of the empty garage, Sarah Miller couldn't shake the terrifying premonition that the man who had walked out of her life that morning would never walk back in. The mystery had just begun. Detective Frank O'Connell arrived on the scene just before midnight. He was a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the weary resignation of someone who had seen too much. With over 25 years on the force, he was methodical, patient, and trusted his gut above all else. Stepping into Miller's workshop, he was immediately struck by the profound lack of chaos. Crime scenes were typically messy, a whirlwind of struggle and desperation. This was something else entirely. It was a scene defined by absence. O'Connell's initial walkthrough confirmed Sarah's frantic report. There were no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no blood. Forensics dusted for prints, but it was a mechanic's garage. Smudges of oil and grime coated nearly every surface, making it a nightmare for analysis. It's like he was here 1 second, and the next, he just evaporated, a younger officer remarked. O'Connell grunted in response, his eyes scanning the workbench. The cold coffee mug, the neatly laid out tools, it felt staged, too perfect. The first and most crucial interview was with the last known person to have seen Danny, Richard Croft. O'Connell and his partner drove to Croft's sprawling estate on the edge of town, a modern fortress of glass and steel that stood in stark contrast to the rustic charm of Cedar Creek. Croft, a man in his mid-40s with a mane of silvering hair and an air of detached arrogance, met them at the door. He was dressed in a silk robe, appearing more annoyed than concerned by the late-night visit from the police. Croft's story was smooth, polished, and delivered with an unnerving calm. "Yes, I was there," he stated, leading them into a cavernous living room overlooking the dark forest. "Danny called me around 4 p.m., said the carburetor tune-up was finished. I drove over, paid him in cash as we'd agreed, and took my car. He was fine, maybe a little tired. Said he was rushing to get to his daughter's game. He offered them a drink, which they declined, his hospitality feeling more like a power play than a genuine gesture." Detective O'Connell pressed him on the details, the exact time, the nature of their conversation. Did Danny mention any other plans? Croft's answers were unwavering, a seamless narrative that left no room for doubt. He claimed he drove the Shelby straight home and parked it in his private, climate-controlled garage. When O'Connell asked to see the vehicle, Croft agreed without hesitation, leading them to a showroom that housed a dozen classic cars, each one gleaming under spotlights. The Shelby was there, looking immaculate. The cash payment was an immediate red flag for the detectives. "How much did you pay him, Mr. Croft?" O'Connell asked, his gaze steady. $1,500, Croft replied coolly. He did excellent work, but a search of the workshop and a later search of the Miller home revealed no such cash. It wasn't in Danny's wallet, his toolbox, or his bank account. Croft simply shrugged. "I can't say what he did with it after I left. Maybe he had to pay a supplier." Daniel handled his own books. Back at the station, the timeline started to form, but it was a skeleton with crucial bones missing. Danny was last seen by Croft at approximately 4:30 p.m. His phone was used to check his voicemail at 4:35 p.m., likely the call from Sarah. After that, the digital trail went cold. The phone was never used again, and its last ping was from a tower that covered the industrial park and the surrounding forest. The window of opportunity for whatever happened was terrifyingly narrow. The physical search began at dawn. Dozens of volunteers from the tight-knit community joined police officers, combing the dense woods that bordered the industrial park. They called Danny's name until their voices were hoarse, the sound swallowed by the thick canopy of Douglas firs. The air was damp and smelled of moss and earth, a beautiful landscape that now felt ominous, capable of hiding the darkest of secrets. The searchers found nothing but discarded litter and animal tracks. Days turned into a week. Sarah Miller became a fixture at the police station, her face a mask of sleepless exhaustion and desperate hope. She provided O'Connell with every detail she could think of. Danny had no known enemies, no gambling debts, no secret life. He was a good man, a family man. He wouldn't just leave, she repeated, her voice raw with emotion. "Someone has to know something. People don't just disappear." Her words hung in the sterile air of the precinct, plea and a condemnation all at once. Despite the lack of evidence pointing directly at him, Richard Croft remained the sole focus of O'Connell's suspicion. The story was too clean, the man too composed. But without a body, a weapon, or a clear motive, suspicion was all he had. The pristine garage, the missing cash, and the powerful, unshakable man at the center of it all created a frustrating, impenetrable wall. The investigation had hit a dead end almost before it had truly begun, leaving behind a grieving family and a ghost in a silent garage. The first year after Danny's disappearance was a blur of police briefings, false hopes, and the crushing weight of public sympathy. The initial flurry of activity dwindled to a trickle, and then to silence. The search parties stopped, the news crews packed up their vans, and the town of Cedar Creek slowly, uncomfortably, moved on. For Sarah and Lily, however, time had frozen on that rainy June day. Every passing car that resembled Danny's old truck, every distant shout that sounded like his voice, was a fresh stab of pain. Sarah refused to let her husband become a forgotten file. She plastered the town with missing posters, the smiling image of Danny fading and peeling in the relentless Oregon rain. She organized vigils on the anniversary of his disappearance, standing on the steps of the town hall with a small group of loyal friends, her voice trembling but resolute as she spoke of the man she loved. She became a reluctant activist, a woman, defined by her husband's absence, her life a constant, agonizing campaign for answers. Lily, who was just a girl when her father vanished, grew into a young woman in the shadow of his memory. The other children at school didn't know what to say to her. Their whispers followed her down the hallways. She learned to navigate a world that was missing its most important piece. Her father became an almost mythical figure, a collection of photographs and her mother's stories. The softball glove he bought her gathered dust on a shelf, a relic from a life she could barely remember. 5 years passed. Detective Frank O'Connell retired from the Cedar Creek Police Department, a celebrated officer with a distinguished career. Yet, among his commendations and solved cases, the Miller file remained a source of deep, personal failure. He kept a copy of the case file in his home office, occasionally spreading the crime scene photos across his desk, staring into the face of Richard Croft, searching for the crack he had never been able to find. The case became his white whale, the one that got away. Richard Croft, meanwhile, seemed to prosper. A year after Danny's disappearance, he sold the 1967 Shelby Mustang at a high-end car auction in Arizona. He expanded his business empire, donating generously to local charities and political campaigns, cementing his status as a pillar of the community. To the outside world, he was a shrewd and successful businessman. To Sarah Miller and Frank O'Connell, he was a man who had gotten away with something terrible. His wealth and influence a shield against the truth. The Miller house, once filled with laughter and the smell of Danny's cooking, became a quiet sanctuary of memory. Sarah kept his workshop key on her own keyring, a heavy, cold piece of metal that served as a constant reminder. Sometimes, late at night, she would drive there and just sit in her car, staring at the darkened building, as if willing it to give up its secrets. The industrial park was even quieter now, some of the neighboring businesses having closed down over the years. That's the 10th anniversary approached. A local news station ran a short segment on the cold case. They interviewed a weary Sarah, her face etched with a decade of grief and uncertainty. They spoke to a retired O'Connell, who voiced his lingering frustrations. They even managed to get a terse no comment from Richard Croft through the intercom. At his gated estate, the story was a brief flicker of attention, a momentary ripple in the town's collective memory, before sinking back into the depths of forgotten news. For Lily, now 18, the anniversary brought a new resolve. She began to ask her mother more pointed questions, not about the father she missed, but about the investigation itself. She spent hours online, reading about cold cases and forensic techniques. The vague, shadowy loss of her childhood began to crystallize into a concrete, solvable problem. She wanted justice, not just for the father she barely knew, but for the mother whose life had been consumed by the search. Life in Cedar Creek had settled into a new normal. New families moved in, new businesses opened, and the story of the vanished mechanic became a piece of local folklore, a cautionary tale whispered to newcomers. The missing posters were long gone, replaced by advertisements for festivals and elections. For most, the name Danny Miller was a distant memory, if it was a memory at all. But for a few, the trail had not gone cold. It was merely dormant, waiting. In the sterile archives of the state police headquarters, Danny Miller's case file, thick with old reports and dead-end leads, sat in a cardboard box. It was a monument to failure, a testament to a mystery that had resisted every effort to be solved. But the nature of justice is patient. Unbeknownst to anyone, a new initiative was taking shape, a cold case unit designed to breathe life into dormant investigations, and a new detective was about to blow the dust off a 14-year-old mystery. In the spring of 2025, the Oregon State Police announced the formation of a new homicide and cold case unit. The initiative was born from a combination of political pressure and advances in forensic science. Detective Isabella Rossi, a sharp, tenacious investigator in her late 30s with a reputation for seeing patterns where others saw chaos, was one of the first to be assigned. She was given a stack of files, each one representing a life cut short or a family left in limbo. The name on the top of the pile was Daniel Miller. Rossi began by immersing herself in the 14-year-old file. She spent days in a windowless room, the air thick with the smell of old paper. She didn't just read the reports, she absorbed them. She studied the crime scene photos of the silent, pristine garage, memorized the transcripts of O'Connell's interviews, and traced the fruitless search patterns through the dense forests on oversized maps. She felt the frustration of the original investigation, the solid wall they had run into. Unlike O'Connell, Rossi had the benefit of distance and technology. She ran the names of everyone involved through updated databases, searching for new connections or subsequent offenses. She noted that Richard Croft had sold the Shelby a year after the disappearance, and using vehicle registration records, she began to trace the car's ownership history. It had passed through 4 different collectors over the years, a ghost moving silently across the country. Rossi's first call was to the man whose life had been defined by the case, retired Detective Frank O'Connell. She found him living a quiet life of fishing and gardening. But the moment she mentioned the Miller case, a fire she suspected never truly went out was rekindled. "It was Croft," O'Connell said, his voice raspy over the phone. "I never had a shred of physical evidence, but in my gut, I knew it was him. He was too calm, too clean. It was a performance." Armed with O'Connell's insights and her own fresh perspective, Rossi decided her first in-person visit should be to Sarah Miller. She found Sarah living in the same small house, a home preserved in time. Over coffee at the kitchen table where Danny once sat, Rossi listened. She didn't just ask questions. She listened to the story of the man, not just the victim. She felt the palpable grief that still radiated from Sarah after all these years, a wound that had never been allowed to heal. "He made me this," Sarah said, her fingers tracing the interlocking links of a simple silver bracelet on her wrist. "He was always tinkering, making things. He even made himself a ring, a simple steel band from an old motorcycle bearing. He said it was tougher than any gold or silver. He never took it off." Rossi made a note. The original file mentioned Danny wasn't wearing his wedding ring, but this custom band was a new detail, a small piece of the man that hadn't been officially recorded. Next, Rossi approached the lion in his den. She scheduled a meeting with Richard Croft, now nearing 60, his hair completely white, but his posture as rigid and commanding as ever. He met her in a downtown Portland office, a space of minimalist furniture and panoramic city views. Far from the whispering pines of Cedar Creek, he remembered the case, of course, but spoke of it as a distant, unfortunate tragedy that had briefly and inconveniently intersected with his life. Rossi watched him carefully as she guided him back through the events of that day. He didn't deviate one word from the story he had given O'Connell 14 years ago. The narrative was as polished and seamless as ever. It was this very perfection that pricked at Rossi. Human memory wasn't like that. It frayed, it gained emotional color, detail shifted. Croft's memory was like a recording, played back without error. It was the testimony of a man who had rehearsed his lines. She left the meeting with Croft, feeling the same gut certainty that O'Connell had described. There was no new evidence, no slip of the tongue, but the feeling was undeniable. The truth was buried somewhere in that man's perfect, unyielding story. Rossi knew that conventional methods wouldn't break him. She needed something he couldn't control, a piece of the past that could be brought into the present, a whisper from the pines that could finally be heard. Back in her office, Rossi pinned a map of the United States to a corkboard. She began to mark the locations of the Shelby Mustang's subsequent owners, a trail leading from Arizona to Texas, then to Florida, and finally to a small town in upstate New York. It felt like a long shot, a wild goose chase across a continent and through 14 years of history, but it was the only piece of the puzzle that had ever moved, and Rossi had a feeling it was the piece that could unlock everything. In a quiet, well-lit garage in Ithaca, New York, a man named Ben Carter was about to stumble into a 14-year-old mystery. Ben was a retired engineer and a passionate car restorer, and the 1967 Shelby GT500 was his holy grail. He'd purchased it from a collector in Florida a few months prior, spending a significant portion of his retirement savings. The car was beautiful, but Ben, a perfectionist, felt its engine didn't have the crisp, powerful roar it should. He decided on a full, meticulous engine teardown and rebuild. For weeks, Ben's garage was filled with the rhythmic sounds of tools and the smell of degreaser. He carefully disassembled the massive 428 Cobra jet engine, laying out each component. On a clean white sheet, he catalogued every piston, every valve, every bearing. It was a slow, meditative process, a conversation with the machine's history. He noted the non-original parts, the subtle signs of past repairs, piecing together the life the car had lived before it reached him. The discovery came on a crisp autumn afternoon. Ben was cleaning the engine block itself, a heavy, greasy hunk of cast iron. He was using a long, flexible borescope camera to inspect the internal coolant passages for any blockages or corrosion, a step most mechanics would skip. As he maneuvered the tiny camera deep within the labyrinthine channels of the block, something glinted back at him in the LED light, an unnatural shape lodged deep within the casting. His curiosity piqued. Ben spent the next hour working with a set of long, slender retrieval tools, like a surgeon performing a delicate operation. It was lodged tightly in a narrow passage near the number 4 cylinder, a place it could only have reached if the engine was almost completely disassembled. Finally, with a soft click, he managed to grasp the object and painstakingly pull it free. It dropped onto his clean white sheet with a dull, metallic clink. It was not a car part. It was a ring, a simple, thick band of what looked like dark, machined steel. It was heavily scorched and deformed, as if it had been subjected to immense heat and pressure. One side was crushed inward, mangled almost beyond recognition. Ben, an avid watcher of true crime documentaries, felt a strange chill run down his spine. This was wrong. This felt like evidence of something. Unsure of what to do, Ben remembered seeing an old vehicle registration slip in the glove box from a previous owner in Oregon. On a whim, he typed "Old Oregon Cold Case and Missing Mechanic" into a search engine. The name Danny Miller immediately filled his screen. He read the story of the mechanic who vanished while working on a classic car, the same model that was now in pieces in his garage. His heart began to pound. Detective Isabella Rossi was reviewing land ownership records related to Richard Croft. When the call came in, the voice on the other end was hesitant. A man named Ben Carter from New York. He started by apologizing if he was wasting her time, but then he began to describe the car, the engine teardown, and the strange, scorched ring he had found lodged deep inside the engine block. Rossi sat bolt upright in her chair, a jolt of adrenaline surging through her. She had Ben emailed her a high-resolution photo of the object. When the image loaded on her screen, she zoomed in on the mangled piece of steel. It was not a wedding band. It was thick, industrial, and looked handmade. She immediately recalled her conversation with Sarah Miller, her description of the unique ring Danny had fashioned for himself from a motorcycle bearing, a ring he never took off. This had to be it. Within hours, Rossi was on a plane to Ithaca. She met Ben at his home, the disassembled Shelby engine looking like a massive, complex puzzle on his garage floor. He handed her the ring, which she carefully placed in an evidence bag. He showed her the exact spot within the engine block where he had found it, a place so inaccessible that its presence could not have been an accident. It had been put there, deliberately, holding the small, heavy object in her gloved hand. Rossi knew this was the breakthrough she had been searching for. It was more than a piece of metal. It was a voice from the past, a silent witness that had been carried across the country for 14 years. The engine had held its secret long enough. Now, it was finally giving a clue, a tangible link between Danny Miller and the machine he was working on the day he disappeared. The cold trail was suddenly scorching hot. The flight back to Oregon was the longest of Detective Rossi's career. The small, mangled ring, secured in an evidence container, felt as heavy as a tombstone in her carry-on bag. It was the first piece of tangible hope in 14 years, a fragment of a life that had been violently erased. She knew her next step was the most delicate and potentially heartbreaking of the entire investigation. She had to show the ring to Sarah Miller. Rossi found Sarah tending to her garden, her hands covered in soil. There was a quiet strength about her, a resilience forged in years of uncertainty. Rossi didn't preamble. She sat with Sarah on the porch swing, the same one Danny had built, and gently explained the discovery in New York. She spoke of the car, the new owner, and the object found deep within the engine. With painstaking care, she opened the evidence bag and showed Sarah the photo she had taken. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her hand flew to her mouth, and her eyes, which had seen so much grief, filled with a fresh wave of pain and recognition. "That's it," she whispered, her voice trembling as she stared at the image on Rossi's phone. "That's Danny's ring. He made it from the main bearing of an old Triumph Bonneville. See that little groove on the inside? He said it made it more comfortable. Even through the damage and scorching, the unique characteristic was faintly visible. The confirmation was emotionally devastating, but provided the undeniable proof Rossi needed. This ring physically tied Danny Miller to the inside of that engine. It wasn't just found in the car. It was found in a place that suggested a catastrophic, violent event. The next step was forensic analysis. At the Oregon State Police Crime Lab, technicians went to work on the fragment from the past, their modern tools probing the secrets of the 14-year-old object. The lab report came back with stunning revelations. Microscopic analysis revealed trace evidence embedded in the scorched metal. They found minuscule particles of human bone and tissue, fused to the ring by extreme heat. The DNA from these particles was degraded, but through advanced techniques, they were able to get a partial profile. It was a match to the familial DNA provided by Danny's daughter, Lily, years ago. He had not just vanished. He had been subjected to something horrific. The report also detailed the nature of the damage to the ring itself. Metallurgists determined that the scorching was consistent with a rapid, intense combustion event, like a gasoline fire. The extreme pressure that had deformed it suggested it had been caught between two incredibly hard moving surfaces like a piston and a cylinder wall. The evidence painted a gruesome picture. The ring, and likely Danny's hand, had been inside the engine when it was catastrophically destroyed. Armed with a positive ID and a forensic report that read like a horror story, Rossi finally had the leverage she needed. The narrative had shifted. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was a homicide investigation. The ghost in the garage now had a voice, and it was screaming from the mangled steel of a simple, handmade ring. Her focus narrowed once again onto the man who had remained untouchable for over a decade. Richard Croft. Rossi re-interviewed everyone from the original witness list, from neighbors of the workshop to suppliers Danny had worked with the new evidence as a guide. She asked different questions. She wasn't asking if they saw anything. She was asking if they heard anything. One elderly man who had lived nearby in 2011 and had been dismissed as unreliable at the time, now recounted hearing a loud, strange noise from the direction of Miller's garage that afternoon. Not the usual sound of tools, but a sudden violent bang, followed by silence. The timeline was becoming clearer, darker. Danny was working on the engine. Croft was there. A loud bang was heard. Danny disappeared, leaving everything behind, and a critical piece of him, his ring, ended up deep inside the engine block of the car he was fixing. Croft's polished story about a simple tune-up and a cash payment now seemed like a flimsy, almost insulting lie. Detective Rossi prepared to face Richard Croft again. This time, she wouldn't be coming with questions and gut feelings. She was coming with a piece of Danny Miller himself. She had the fragment of the past, the scorched and broken ring that had traveled across the country, silently waiting for the day it could tell its story. The walls Croft had built around himself for 14 years were about to be torn down. The second interrogation of Richard Croft was strategically different from the first. Rossi didn't summon him to a formal office. Instead, she and her partner met him at his upscale car storage facility, the same place O'Connell had visited 14 years prior. She wanted him in his element, surrounded by the polished steel and leather that served as his armor. The air in the showroom was cool and still, smelling faintly of wax and old money, a stark contrast to the storm that was about to break. Croft, now 60, appeared as confident and unruffled as ever. He greeted them with a condescending smile, gesturing to his collection. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Detective, have you come to admire my latest acquisition?" His tone was light, but Rossi could detect a flicker of tension in his eyes. He knew this wasn't a social call. She let him lead the conversation, allowing his arrogance to fill the space between the priceless machines. Rossi began calmly, walking him through his old story one more time. The 4 p.m. call from Danny, the tune-up, the $1,500 in cash, the drive home. She let him recite the well-rehearsed lines without interruption, her expression neutral. Croft's narrative was identical, a carbon copy of the tale he'd told O'Connell, a story frozen in time. He leaned against a vintage Porsche, the picture of a man with nothing to hide. "That's a very consistent story, Mr. Croft," Rossi said, her voice dropping to a more serious register. "Almost too consistent. But we have a new piece of information." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. From her briefcase, she removed a clear evidence folder containing a large, high-resolution photograph of the mangled ring. She slid it onto the polished hood of the Porsche in front of him. "We found this. Does it look familiar to you?" Croft's eyes flickered down to the photograph. For the first time in 14 years, his composure shattered. A subtle tremor ran through his hand, and the blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, papery white. He stared at the image of the scorched, deformed ring, and in that moment, Rossi saw the man behind the mask, a man shocked, cornered, and afraid. The wall he had so carefully constructed for nearly a decade and a half began to crumble. "It was found by the new owner of your 1967 Shelby," Rossi continued, her voice cold and precise. "It was lodged deep inside the engine block. Forensics confirmed it belonged to Daniel Miller. They also found his DNA, specifically bone fragments ... fused to the metal." She let the gruesome details land with the force of a physical blow. Croft flinched, taking an involuntary step back from the photograph as if it were radioactive. His denial was weak, instinctual. I don't know what that is. It has nothing to do with me. I sold that car years ago." But the carefully constructed dam of his lies had been breached. Rossi presented a new timeline, one built from the neighbor's testimony of a loud bang and the forensic evidence. "We believe something catastrophic happened in that garage, Mr. Croft. Something that destroyed part of the engine and cost Danny Miller his life." A flashback, constructed from the evidence, begins to play for the viewer. We see Danny in the garage, his hands deep in the Shelby's engine bay. Croft is there, pacing, his face dark with anger. Their voices are raised. Danny points to something. On the engine block, a series of stamped numbers. "This isn't right, Richard." Danny's voice, imagined from Sarah's descriptions, says firmly, "The VIN on the block doesn't match the one on the chassis. This engine is from a stolen car." The imagined scene continues. Croft's face contorts with rage. "You will keep your mouth shut, Miller. You're a grease monkey. You'll do the work I paid you for and forget what you saw." Danny stands his ground. "I can't do that. This is a felony." The argument escalates, the tension reaching a breaking point. Croft, in a fit of fury, slams the heavy hood of the car down, not realizing Danny's hand is still near the engine. The sound is a sickening crunch of metal and bone. Back in the present, Rossi's voice cuts through Croft's panicked silence. "What happened in that garage, Richard? We know you're lying. The forensics tell a story. The ring tells a story. We know he discovered something, didn't he? Something you couldn't let him reveal." Croft stared at her, his mask of civility completely gone, replaced by the raw, desperate look of a man whose past had finally caught up with him. The time for lies was over. The silence in the sterile car showroom was thick with unspoken truths. Richard Croft, stripped of his composure, seemed to shrink before Detective Rossi's eyes. The collection of perfect machines surrounding them, once a symbol of his power and control, now felt like a cage of his own making. Each polished surface reflected his pale, frightened face. Price of maintaining this flawless facade was about to come due, and the currency was a truth he had buried for 14 years. Rossi pressed her advantage, her tone a mix of prosecutorial, steel and calculated empathy. "Danny wasn't just a mechanic, was he, Richard? He was the best. He saw things other people missed. It's what you admired about him, and it's what got him killed." She let the accusation hang in the air. She theorized that Danny's discovery went beyond a simple mechanical issue. It threatened the very foundation of Croft's identity as a master collector. The motive, as Rossi laid it out, was rooted in a potent combination of pride and criminal fraud. The 1967 Shelby GT500 was the crown jewel of Croft's collection, but its provenance was a lie. The original numbers-matching engine had been destroyed in a prior accident. To preserve the car's immense value, Croft had illegally acquired a replacement engine from a stolen vehicle, and had a forger stamp it with a matching vehicle identification number (VIN). It was a perfect counterfeit, undetectable to almost anyone. Danny Miller was not just anyone. As he performed the tune-up, his expert eye caught the subtle inconsistencies: a slight difference in the stamping font, a microscopic weld mark on the chassis where the original VIN plate had been tampered with. It was a discovery that would have rendered the priceless Shelby nearly worthless and exposed Croft as a fraud and a felon. His entire collection, his reputation, everything would be called into question. In a series of tense, reconstructed flashbacks, we see the confrontation from Croft's perspective. He saw Danny not as a man, but as a threat to his perfect world. The argument wasn't just about a car. It was about the potential implosion of his life. "He gave me an ultimatum," Croft's voice, now raspy and strained, finally admits in the present. "He told me to report the car stolen myself, or he would go to the police. He was going to ruin me." The sensory details of that afternoon came flooding back to Croft, and through his fractured admissions, to Rossi. The smell of gasoline was sharp in his nostrils as they argued. He could feel the slick grease on his own hands after he touched the engine block, trying to point to something else, to distract, to lie. He remembered the infuriatingly calm, resolute look in Danny's eyes, the quiet integrity that Croft could not buy or intimidate. "It was an accident," Croft stammered, the words he had likely practiced in his mind for 14 years. "We were arguing, I was angry. I went to slam the hood to scare him, to make him back off. I didn't see his hand." The narrative he offered was one of a tragic mistake, a moment of uncontrolled rage with unforeseen consequences. He claimed the impact of the heavy hood striking Danny's hand on the engine block caused a freak accident. He described a scene of chaos and panic. The impact had not just crushed Danny's hand, but had also shattered a fuel line. A stray spark from the impact, or perhaps from the battery terminal, ignited the spraying gasoline in a violent flash fire. It was the loud bang the neighbor had heard. In a split second, the argument was over, and Croft was standing over the body of Danny Miller, who had been killed instantly by the concussive force and subsequent blunt trauma as he fell backward onto the concrete floor. The story, whilst deserving, fit the forensic evidence: the crushed ring, the scorched bone fragments, the sudden, violent noise. In the aftermath, Croft's calculated mind took over. He saw his life ending, a prison sentence looming. His instinct for self-preservation was absolute. He had to erase what had happened. He had to make Danny Miller and the evidence of his own crime disappear. Croft admitted that in a state of adrenaline-fueled panic. He knew he couldn't leave the body or the damaged engine. The destroyed engine was the proof of the argument, the motive for the crime. His perfectionism, the very trait that led to the confrontation, now drove his cover-up. He had to get rid of the body and replace the engine before anyone else could see it. The price of his perfection had escalated from fraud to homicide, and his next actions would seal his fate. Richard Croft's confession, once it began, spilled out like venom he had held in for 14 years. Standing amidst his flawless collection, he detailed the grim practicalities of his panic. The flash fire in the engine bay had been brief, but intense, extinguished almost as quickly as it began, but it had left its mark on the engine and on Danny's hand. The first thing he did was lower the garage door, plunging the scene into a sudden, tomb-like silence, broken only by his own ragged breathing. He described the terrifying clarity that took hold after the initial shock. He knew the body was his. Biggest problem, his vast estate on the outskirts of Cedar Creek included acres of dense, private woodland. He wrapped Danny's body in a heavy canvas car cover, the irony lost on him in his haste. With Herculean effort, driven by pure adrenaline, he lifted the body into the trunk of another one of his cars, a nondescript sedan, not one of his prized collectibles. His next move was one of cold, calculated foresight. He knew the engine was now evidence. He couldn't risk another mechanic looking at it. Using the engine hoist in Danny's own workshop, Croft single-handedly pulled the damaged 428 Cobra jet from the Shelby. It was a task that would take a team of mechanics hours, but he accomplished it in a frenzy of desperate energy. He then loaded the heavy, greasy engine into the back of his utility truck. Under the cover of the gathering dusk, he made 2 trips. The first was to the deepest, most remote part of his property, a place he knew loggers and hikers never went. There, in the damp Oregon soil, surrounded by the silent judgment of the ancient pines, he dug a shallow grave. He buried Daniel Miller, without a prayer or a moment of remorse, his only thought being the eradication of the problem. He then meticulously covered the site with leaves and fallen branches. The second trip was to a scrap metal yard in a neighboring county, a place that paid cash and didn't ask questions. He watched as a massive industrial crane lifted the damaged engine from his truck, the same engine that held Danny Miller's mangled ring and bone fragments deep within its iron shell. It was dropped into a mountain of twisted metal, destined to be melted down. He paid them extra to have it processed immediately, never imagining that the one tiny, indestructible piece of evidence would somehow survive. Croft then had to account for the Shelby. He couldn't leave it in Danny's garage without an engine. He sourced a new, legitimate crate engine from a supplier and had it delivered. Working through the night, he installed the new engine himself. He cleaned the car meticulously, removing any trace of the fire, and then concocted the story of the 4 p.m. pickup and cash payment. It was a desperate, elaborate lie, but one he knew he could sell with his reputation and wealth. As Croft confessed these details to Rossi, his voice was hollow, devoid of the arrogance that had defined him. He was no longer a powerful collector. He was just a scared old man recounting the series of frantic decisions that had led him to this point. He explained how he had purposely held on to the Shelby for a year to avoid suspicion before finally selling it, wanting to put as much distance as possible between himself and the crime. Detective Rossi listened without interruption, her digital recorder capturing every self-serving, horrifying word. While he clung to the "it was an accident" narrative, his actions afterward told a different story. They were not the actions of a panicked man who made a mistake. They were the cold, methodical steps of a criminal covering his tracks, a man who valued his reputation and his possessions more than a human life. With the confession recorded, the final piece of the puzzle was locating Danny's remains. Croft, now fully cooperative, seemed to find a sliver of relief in surrendering the last of his secrets. He drew a crude map on a notepad for Rossi, marking a specific clearing on his property, identified by an old, lightning-scarred fir tree. He had lived with the knowledge of that spot for 14 years, a secret grave hidden in plain sight. The full weight of his actions finally seemed to crash down on him in the silent showroom. His elaborate world, built on lies and steel, had been brought down by a single, indestructible ring and the tenacity of a detective who refused to let a ghost remain a ghost. Richard Croft was placed under arrest for the murder of Daniel Miller. The confession was complete, but for the Miller family, the final, most painful chapter was just beginning. The recovery mission began at dawn. A convoy of official vehicles moved slowly up the long, winding driveway of Richard Croft's estate, breaking the morning peace. Detective Rossi led a team of forensic anthropologists and law enforcement officers into the woods. Following the crude map Croft had drawn, Sarah and Lily Miller waited at the police station, having been told only that there was a significant development and that they should be together. The wait was an agony of renewed hope and profound dread. The team reached the lightning-scarred fir tree, a grim landmark in the quiet forest. The air was cool and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. For 14 years, this tranquil spot had held a terrible secret. The forensic team began their work with quiet reverence, carefully removing the layers of soil and fallen leaves. It didn't take long. They found the remains of the canvas car cover, and beneath it, the skeletal remains of a man. The discovery brought a somber finality to the scene. This was no longer an abstract cold case. It was the grave of a husband and a father. Detective Rossi stood back, watching the meticulous work, feeling the immense weight of the moment. The whispers in the pines had finally led them here. She made the call to the station, her voice gentle as she informed the waiting family that they had found him. Daniel Miller was coming home. For Sarah and Lily, the news was a complex explosion of emotion. There was the sharp, stabbing pain of confirmed loss, final brutal extinguishing of a hope they hadn't even realized they were still clinging to. But intertwined with the grief was a profound sense of relief. The not knowing, the endless, agonizing limbo, was over. They cried in each other's arms, not just for the man they had lost, but for the end of a 14-year nightmare. Richard Croft's trial was swift. Faced with his own detailed confession, the indestructible ring, and the discovery of the body, his defense was futile. He was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. In the courtroom, he was a diminished figure, a pale shadow of the arrogant millionaire who had once seemed so untouchable. He would spend the rest of his days in a world devoid of polished chrome and custom leather, the true price of his perfection. Justice had been served, but for the miller, women, peace was a more elusive concept. They were finally able to give Danny a proper burial. The funeral was a quiet affair, attended by the friends who had stood by them through the years, and by a retired, emotional Frank O'Connell. They buried him in the Cedar Creek Cemetery, under a simple headstone that read, "Daniel Miller, beloved husband and father, finally at rest." In the months that followed, Sarah and Lily began the slow process of building a new future, one not defined by a question mark. Lily, who had been haunted by the ghost of her father, could now begin to know him through the tangible reality of his story. She enrolled in forensic science courses at her university, driven by a newfound purpose, hoping to help other families trapped in the same limbo she had endured. Sarah found herself visiting the cemetery often. She would sit by Danny's grave and talk to him, telling him about Lily's accomplishments, about the changing seasons, about the simple act of living. The crushing weight of the unknown had been lifted, replaced by the more manageable burden of grief. She could finally mourn without the exhausting task of searching. The silence was no longer empty, it was filled with memory. The town of Cedar Creek was forced to confront the dark secret it had harbored. The story of the vanished mechanic was no longer a piece of local folklore. It was a real and painful tragedy. The case served as a stark reminder that evil could wear a mask of wealth and respectability, and that the quietest places can hide the most terrible truths. The Miller case changed the town, leaving a permanent scar on its collective consciousness. Asterisk, the final scene shows Sarah and Lily Miller, a year after the trial, walking away from Danny's grave. The sun is setting, casting a warm golden light over the cemetery. There is sadness in their eyes, but there is also a strength that wasn't there before. The mystery was solved, the criminal was punished, but the void Danny left could never be filled. Justice had provided answers, but peace would have to be built, day by day. From the enduring power of memory and a love that had outlasted the silence,